Good afternoon. We're very fortunate today to have Dr. Alan Segar, an associate professor of history at Simon Fraser University, with us today. He's a longtime Burnaby resident, and his research and publication focus has been on labor and working class history in Canada. Welcome, Alan.
Thank you, Lisa. It's great to be here in Burnaby Village Museum.
On Radio BVM. Now, a few years ago, you co-authored an article with Rodney Fowler that was published in the Centennial Anthology, Suburb of Happy Homes. And in that article, you described Burnaby as a working class suburb, which is kind of a distinct form of suburb that developed in the early 20th century. Can you tell us a bit more about what a working class suburb is and how you defined Burnaby as one of those?
All right. Well, let's begin by stating that Burnaby in the 1920s and 30s still had some pockets of old-style English country living, pockets of a kind of aristocracy. But the reality was that most of the land development followed the BC electric railway lines. And even though New Westminster and Vancouver were not terribly crowded places in those days, land values were going up. And to fulfill a dream of home ownership, many working class people moved either from New West or Vancouver into the central place, namely Burnaby. In 1929, over 60% of workers in Burnaby were making their living from physical labor, agriculture, laborers, or manual trades, while less than a third were employed in professional or white-collar jobs.
Mm-hmm. And you also noted in your article that even before the Depression, there was quite a bit of support for left of center and socialist politicians in Burnaby, particularly in some of those key neighborhoods along the BC Electric Railway line. In fact, wasn't it the case that they in 1920? Sorry.
Yes.
In fact, you know where I'm going with this, Alan. They had an early history, even before the Depression. There was a bit of a tradition of electing left of center politicians into the community.
Yes, most assuredly. By the early 1920s, Burnaby was sufficiently populated to have its own provincial electoral district that overlapped more or less with the municipal boundaries. And in 1920, they elected a self-described Labour Party candidate, Francis Aubrey Brown, an important individual because he was a civic employee. So he was one of the people on the ground level of planning the city or trying to plan the city. And obviously he was trying to get an entree into the provincial assembly scene to get things done. He was defeated in 1928 when the Conservatives had quite a run in British Columbia, but the Leftwing would come back very quickly after that.
Right. So, in fact, during the Depression, the conditions for labor and socialist politics to grow in Burnaby were definitely there. And in 1933, we saw Burnaby elect Cooperative Commonwealth Federation candidate Ernest Winch, the CCF, of course, the forerunner of today's NDP. Can you tell us a bit about Ernest Winch?
Well, Ernie Winch was an English immigrant who, in the 1890s, was more or less told by his parents to go away, see the world. He was able to actually travel around the world in 1898.
Wow.
He was a skilled worker and sort of worked on ships and so on, and was able to go right around the world. And decided that British Columbia, and specifically White Rock, was the best place in the British Empire. So he moved to White Rock. He had a young wife, and they helped to build the city of White Rock. He was a bricklayer, or really a jack of all trades in the building trades, and later moved on to Burnaby and seemed to be doing reasonably well as a tradesman there and dabbling in school board politics in the 1920s.
And he was a long-serving MLA in Burnaby.
Yeah, he had an incredible record. He was first elected in 1933 and retired undefeated in 1960.
Amazing. And his son, of course, Harold Winch, was also a long-serving representative just right next door in Vancouver East.
That's right. The two of them sort of divided up jurisdictions. Harold grew up in Burnaby, but later moved to East Vancouver. Won a nomination in a kind of a lottery they had in 1933 and got himself elected to the Victoria Assembly that year. He eventually became the leader of the provincial CCF, narrowly lost, maybe by 15 constituency votes cast in Nanaimo or somewhere like that, the 1952 election. As a result of tricks and games by the lieutenant governor, he resigned all his provincial posts as opposition leader and his provincial seat in 1953. And he was so despondent that people thought he was going to just disappear into an alcoholic haze. Yet he was nominated in the federal elections of the 1950s. Even though he didn't really campaign, he still got elected. And so he soldiered on until he was 65 years old. He retired undefeated in 1972. So the Winches are real legends.
Yeah.
That name was worth its weight in gold.
And I understand the Communist Party was also active in Burnaby in the 1930s to some degree.
Right. The great bête noire of the Winches was not so much right-wing opposition, but left-wing opposition, led by the Communist Party, mainly with the base in the emerging forest sector unions. The Communist Party had all kinds of ties with the Pacific Northwest radical movement down in Portland, Oregon, and so on. And from about 1931 to 1949, pretty well dominated the forest sector scene.
Okay.
The Winches believed that the Communist Party was fundamentally mistaken in its view of the Soviet Union. The Winches believed that the Soviet revolution was way too premature, that you had to educate the working classes and the masses and the peasants to a sufficient level of intelligence to make a revolution work. So they never said that revolution was wrong, but they did say that the Soviet revolution was way too premature and that Canadian fellow travelers of the Soviet Union were misguided.
Right. Yeah. Well, it's fascinating how the opposition to the left in Burnaby through the 30s really was from the even further left. And
Exactly.
And I think we saw some of that on a municipal level as well. That
Right.
definitely the far left was a challenge for Reeve Pritchard during the Depression. So
The only thing we lacked in Burnaby, because of the underdevelopment of the University of BC, that campus only got going in 1930, very, very few Burnaby residents attended the university in those days. So we didn't have the sort of ginger groups of Trotskyists and Tolstoyan radicals and people like that.
right.
But certainly the Winches were strong supporters of either liberal or conservative politicians dating back to, Richard McBride's day, who want to get a University of BC going. So that was one issue that was really not a partisan thing.
Yeah.
They all kind of agreed on that,
Yeah.
hoping that the graduates would emerge as their friends.
Yes. Well, we'll have to have you back to talk about the founding of SFU.
Right.
Now, at a municipal level, politics were really pretty non-partisan in the early years of the municipality, and it wasn't until after the Second World War that we really saw slates emerge like we see today. But in Burnaby, by 1929, there were divisions within the municipal council between Labour candidates and more professional candidates. And that's when we see W.A. Pritchard come on the scene, first as a municipal council member in 1929, and then as Reeve from 1930 to 1932. Can you tell us a little bit about Pritchard?
All right. Well, Pritchard, like Ernest Winch, was a founding member of the Socialist Party of Canada, a Vancouver-based Marxist formation back in 1905. As things tumbled out, Pritchard and Winch did not really see eye to eye, Pritchard believed that you should really focus on the local practical issues that could be doable, whereas the Winches still had this kind of dreamy idea of changing the world. Pritchard, I believe his grandfather came to Canada to mine coal on Vancouver Island. He was able to get out of the mines and cobble together a living doing all kinds of things, running gas stations, et cetera, et cetera. He had tangled with the federal government in 1919 when, he represented the Dockers Union in Vancouver as a business agent and traveled to Winnipeg during the general strike. And that pattern of travel convinced the Department of Justice that this was part of a conspiracy to close down the city of Winnipeg and the Vancouver docks. So they put him on trial for seditious. It was a complicated trial. It was not under the new section of the criminal code that defined communist activities and so on. It was an old statute about treason to the crown. And Pritchard was able to just make mincemeat of the prosecution in Winnipeg. I believe he spent maybe 6 months in jail, came back to Vancouver as a hero. He hadn't done much in the strike, but he had played quite a role in the strike trials. So he had a reputation. He ran for the Provincial Assembly for the last time in 1925. Didn't succeed, so he turned his energies to try to build a civic reform movement in Burnaby that did not call itself socialist. All right? Mm-hmm. He wanted a big coalition of working class activists and people interested in planning the community, because the only planners who had played much of a role prior to 1929 were the BC Electric executives. And in Pritchard's view, the BC Electric had run its course. It was now time to get a municipal planning system going.
Mm-hmm. And so he manages to get himself elected to Burnaby Council in 1929. He runs for Reeve and is successful in 1930. And of course, this coincides with the Depression. So I know a lot of local people in Burnaby were hopeful that Pritchard's radical approach was going to serve them well during the Depression, that he would be a strong advocate for the community. And in fact, he was. He not only was the Reeve of Burnaby, he was the president of the Union of BC Municipalities in 1931. He chaired an unemployment committee at the UBCM, representing BC municipalities to the federal government. But maybe I should just take a step back and ask you, can you tell us a little bit about the challenges that municipalities specifically faced during the Depression in BC?
Well, first of all, the municipalities were primarily, if not exclusively, responsible for relief. That's 1930s code for welfare.
Right.
The only exception to that rule were people who were eligible for a provincial plan called the Mother's Allowance or Mother's Pension. Mm-hmm. This allowed single women who could, go before a board or assemble the paperwork necessary to get a stipend of $25 a month to look after children at home. So that was the provincial contribution, but in terms of what they called married men's relief, the municipalities were solely responsible for that. Yeah. Now, what Pritchard and his supporters at the Union of it was actually the Union of Canadian Municipalities. Okay. Like, he was fronting for heavy hitters like Mayor Hood of Montreal, a guy who had like hundreds of thousands of families, not just hundreds or thousands of families on relief.
Yes.
So he was fronting for these bigger players in the municipal game, and their idea was to get block grants from the federal government for infrastructure projects that would employ people disemployed in the private sector.
Yeah, this is essentially Roosevelt's New Deal.
Yeah, it was like the Roosevelt New Deal before the Roosevelt New Deal
Yeah.
was set up. Of course, what Pritchard and the people at the Union of Canadian Municipalities lacked was a bureaucracy or a brain trust who could figure all of this out.
Yeah.
They basically had an idea, put it out there, and did their best to try to make it work. There was a report done in 1932 by a federal appointee named Charlotte Whitten, who described Burnaby's problem as the most serious among what she called larger communities in British Columbia. She marshaled some data to suggest that Burnaby's rate of people being on relief or welfare was higher than any other major municipality, like the city of Vancouver or New Westminster or Victoria. Now, there's a lot of debate about these numbers. Lisa, in those days we didn't have an unemployment insurance system, so therefore there were no data on unemployment or labor force participation.
Yeah.
Ms. Whitten, she was an equal opportunity critic of the relief system. She criticized the federal government for making non-conditional grants to provinces. The provinces then gave the money to municipalities regardless of need, all right? So West Vancouver, a relatively affluent community, got the same amount of money as Burnaby, which was identified as this kind of place where there were a lot of young working class people who were, let's say, first hired,
First fired.
fired at the time of the Great Depression. So
Yeah.
she criticized this system of giving block grants without discernment in terms of need. So that's why she was marshaling those numbers to try to argue in favor of a more targeted approach. Ms. Whitten also criticized the provincial government for its mother's allowance scheme. Like, she believed that if you gave welfare to single mothers, you were just going to create a class of welfare dependents. Like, she was a conservative critic, not a radical critic of the system. And then finally, she criticized local leaders who were too generous, in her view, in terms of treatment of the married unemployed class. And she specifically singled out Reeve Pritchard for this real or imagined deviation from a norm. But of course, Lisa, there was no norm. I mean, there were no data. Reeve Pritchard was sympathetic to the working class, but there's no evidence he was shoveling money off the back of a truck. He was trying to get the Lougheed Highway built. He was trying to realign the streets on Capitol Hill. I think there were just a density of politics involved here.
Yeah.
Reeve and Whitten, they were just not on the same page, even though they both understood that there were deep flaws in the system.
And so, and Pritchard did spend quite a bit of the money he received from other levels of government on these infrastructure projects, as well as money from within Burnaby. But he had a lot of challenges. One was that quite a significant percentage of Burnaby homeowners found themselves unable to pay their property taxes during the Depression. And on the other hand, being a fairly radical a strain of radical politics within the community, the unemployed were organizing and were pressuring Pritchard and Burnaby for better treatment. So he was really caught between a lot of different forces, feeling squeezed between various levels of government.
If, for example, it's hard to imagine, but if Pritchard and his city council had started evicting people for not paying taxes, there would have been riots led by community groups or maybe Communist Party activists in Burnaby. So that was not done. So the city is losing, it was actually called a district in those days, it was not yet a city, is losing its tax revenue from the ordinary homeowners at the same time as its very few industrial taxpayers were going out of business. There was still a fragment of the old forest industry when Pritchard came to power in 1929 on Burrard Inlet, but by 1932, they had completely gone out of business. Now, Pritchard tried to build an industrial tax base by, and this is very controversial today, it was Pritchard who made the first deals with the oil companies based on the North Shore to expand their operations on the Burnaby side of Burrard Inlet. And this is very controversial today because it is the root and anchor of the debate over oil exports today. In Pritchard's day, the idea was to get California crude into Burrard Inlet and manufacture it into oil products for the Canadian market. Maybe at some future date they would connect with the prairie fields. But I want to emphasize this. Pritchard was a Democrat, not just a socialist. He was a Democrat. On the hot button issue of oil refineries back in 1931, because even in those times there were plenty of people opposed to it, he agreed to a referendum vote. So it was the voters of Burnaby who decided to allow the original oil installations here. It was not a unilateral decision by the Reeve or even the council.
Yes. Well, that's an amazing story and very relevant at this moment in history. Now, we actually have a clip of Reeve Pritchard, of an interview with W.L. Pritchard. And in the clip, he's talking about the problem, some of the problems he faced, inconsistency between the pay that different relief workers working on different government programs were receiving, about the problem of delayed payments. So they would have to pay the relief workers on the day, but their payments from other levels of government might not come right away. And he also talks about his conflict with Gideon Robertson, who was the federal minister of labor at the time of, as you mentioned earlier, the trial for the Winnipeg general strike. And he had not been very kind to Mr. Robertson during that time. And now he found Robertson having influence over politics in the 1930s once again. So let's play the clip.
On that point, Mr. Pritchard.
Just a minute.
Yeah, go ahead.
We were paying the people who worked down the ditch, down below, 25 cents a day more than the $4 that were paid to other workers. And this was 25 cents more than the relief was set by the government. But this was work undertaken under bond issue and was our contribution to the relief work. It was also a contract between the municipality and the employees. And this man wanted us to break a contract between employer and employees. And this is the thing, they were going to stop that. And I came from Victoria one day back to Burnaby, and the order had come from Ottawa to close down all the relief work. I called a public meeting in North Burnaby and told the world at large, the relief work goes on tomorrow, be on the job. And that's what happened, you see. Then later, when we didn't get the money for the work we get done for the government, together with the overhead, 5 projects almost completed before we got a penny on the first one. The men that were digging ditches in the lanes and clearing parks and were in a worse position than the municipal employers on water, roads and sewers, there was no money for them. The money was there, it was in the sinking funds, and I was guilty of dipping into the sinking funds to pay these men, and the judge said, what could you do? I pleaded guilty, but he would suspend it. And he said, this man probably saved the municipality from revolution. And he sent word to Victoria that the acts of the chairman of finance and the treasurer and Reeve Pritchard be legalized. That was his request. It hasn't been done yet.
Still waiting.
Huh?
Still waiting.
You know?
Mr. Penner? Yeah. This, the point that
So, of course, the other thing he talks about in that clip is being taken to court for dipping into municipal funds to pay the relief workers during a time of shortfall. But I think that clip really gives you that sense of all the forces that were squeezing in on
Indeed.
him.
It's really interesting to hear Pritchard's voice, because even though he was brought to Canada as a very young person, he still spoke like a North of England miner.
Yes.
It's not until you get to, let's say, Harold Winch, who came to Canada when he was about maybe 6 months old, that you find these old British working class people speaking like Canadians.
Right. Right.
And there would have been a lot of members of the sort of Canadian professional or middle class elite who would have had issues with Pritchard as soon as he opened his mouth, because those class distinctions were so audible.
Right. Right.
Right.
Absolutely. And I thought it was interesting in the clip too that he doesn't talk about the people doing work for the municipality as relief workers. He calls them municipal employees. All these years later, in his
Yes.
mind, they were his staff.
Right. And that was a brilliant way of one of his issues was to make sure that there wasn't friction between trade unionists and people building highways and that
Right.
kind of thing on municipal relief. So it suited him philosophically and practically to just avoid that talk about relief work or make work.
Yes.
Municipal employees.
Yes. Yes. Now, unfortunately, his term came to an end in 1932 when Burnaby was forced into receivership. Can you speak a bit to what happened?
Well, as we talked about before, the tax base of Burnaby virtually evaporated at that time. The oil refinery was a great idea in the longer term, but that was a long-term thing.
Yeah.
So debts were mounting rapidly, the costs of relief were high and growing. Payments from the provincial and federal government were slow to come, and actually in about 1932, the Ottawa government started to listen to Charlotte Whitten in a very selective way. Mm-hmm. In other words, they took the message that we're spending too much, and they began to cut back on the municipal grants. The unemployed were demanding more, while the province and Canada were accusing Burnaby of being too generous, and there were people in the provincial finance department who had no sympathy for Pritchard and jumped on this issue of him dipping into sinking funds, or the capital of the municipality, to pay current costs. And there was a showdown over a minor issue of an interest coupon, $25, a very symbolic issue. Mm-hmm. Pritchard persuaded the municipal council to default on this issue. So, in effect, he dared the province to take over the municipal relief file, and that is exactly what happened.
So from 1932 until 1942, for 10 years, the district of Burnaby was governed directly by the province, by
Right.
a commissioner that they appointed.
Right. The Ministry of Finance in Victoria, together with an appointed relief commissioner who did his best to do a kind of one-size-fits-all kind of policy, ran the city.
Yeah.
But they did continue with Pritchard's idea of building a tax base in Burnaby. Their biggest achievement was the luring the Ford Motor Company to build an assembly plant in what is now Metrotown.
Yes.
It was a great idea because Henry Ford thought that he could use that as a jump-off point for exporting cars to Japan. But Lisa, look, this is 1938. The time is just not right for this grand geopolitical scheme of linking Burnaby with the Ford Motor Company and global trade. It just wasn't on.
No. Now, there were other municipalities that went into receivership during the war. Well, many across Canada, and I think there were 4 others in British Columbia. But when you look over this history, it feels like there was a particularly heavy hand dealt to Pritchard. Do you think that was the case?
Yes, I believe so. The other major cases in the interior of BC involved towns in the copper or coal country where industry was on a long-term slide. I mean, the issue really wasn't about the Depression. It was about the long-term decline of certain mineral industries and mines. So I think we can set those aside. Those were kind of inevitable developments. The issue around putting Burnaby under receivership, in my view, was much more political. It was about squelching dissent from junior government. And remember that Pritchard was not just a local player. He was building this parallel confederacy through the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, which had not been a player before. They played a bit of a role in 1913, but then they were sort of buried by the wartime big government project in Ottawa, and it wasn't until 1929 or 1930 that they came on the scene. You couldn't keep those people down because the reality is urbanization was going to proceed regardless of the backward steps of the economy.
Yeah.
And a generation or two later, we're back to the issue of how to reconcile the Canadian Constitution and fiscal transfers with city needs.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, Burnaby has remained a place where left of center politics are very healthy at all levels of government. Do you think that experience during the Depression helps to explain some of that, or is there something else about Burnaby?
Well, there was certainly a large generation of activists within the CCF, or other left movements, who remembered the Depression era, had grievances against the province or against the prime ministers of the day, and believed that Pritchard and the Winches had done their best. So there was a legacy there. However, I think more important is how the so-called left wing in Burnaby has been able to connect with professional planners, people involved in long-term thinking about the development of a city. The left wing in modern-day Burnaby has never opposed development, right? Their mantra always is to try to link property development or compaction of neighborhoods or high-rises with the expansion of transit and municipal services. So that old pragmatic style of linking a left-wing agenda to a city vision rooted in the 1920s, carrying on today, to me is the secret of their success.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Alan. That was fascinating to be able to talk about this with you today.
Well, thank you very much, Lisa, and I'm so thrilled to be able to participate in BVM 2013.